Hey, Gathering family, this is Pastor Nick here. It is a beautiful Monday morning, and I was just reflecting on Sunday's message. Um, I want to know Jesus like I know my wife. I made that comment about 6 months ago, and I haven't been able to live it down ever since with God, so to speak. He's just been constantly bringing that up, and whether I like to admit it or not, I don't know Jesus as well as I know my wife. And I started thinking about in the whole aspect of what we've been talking about all month, relationships. Why is my relationship with my wife? Why do I know her better than I know Jesus? And thinking about relationships, how do you get to know somebody? You spend time with them. And I have reflected on my relationship with my wife. I've spent almost 16 years with her. Our relationship started when I was in the eighth grade, at the end of eighth grade. Uh, and It's hard to imagine now, looking back on it, that it's been that long. But I started thinking about, well, what did we do for me to know her so well? And then in the beginning, back in eighth grade, we didn't have our license. We couldn't go drive and see each other. So most of our time was spent talking on the phone. And we spent hours almost every night just talking to each other. And that went on for almost a year before we ever really started hanging out with each other and seeing each other physically. So I started comparing and contrasting my relationship with my wife to my relationship with Jesus. And how do we get to know Jesus? How do we get to know who he is and what he's about and what he did? And so for me, that started with prayer. Because what is prayer? Prayer is just talking to God, having a conversation. And how often do we have a conversation with God and it's one-sided? It's always what I want or what somebody else wants or needs. And how often in prayer do you spend time just listening? Because if prayer is talking with God or building a relationship with God, spending time with God, then you need to spend some time letting him speak to you. And unfortunately, I hate to admit that I haven't spent as much time with God as I have my wife. But I think the first part of getting humble and taking a step forward is admitting where you are. So that's where I started. And for a long time, obviously I have spent a lot of time running from Jesus, and when I was younger, and so I felt this need to have to catch up. I felt this need to have to I felt like I was behind in my relationship with God, so I needed to catch up. I needed to do more, to learn more, and I always was looking for the next thing. And this whole time in asking God, what does I want to know Jesus like I know my wife looked like? He said, just spend time with me. Don't have an agenda. And so I started thinking about that, and it was like, well, what would be so wrong or so crazy if I just spent an entire year just doing one thing? If you just spend an entire year in prayer. So I decided to do that. It's just what if I spent this entire year just learning about prayer, studying about prayer, spending time in prayer, learning about how people in the Bible prayed, how Jesus prayed, and not worrying so much about how educated you are, how much you know, or what different levels of society or education you're in, and just spending time with God and letting him tell you what to do. I heard the comment just this morning on the way over here. Too often we try to impress people with our letters beside our name, our education, our degrees, our titles, our stature in society, and God God is more than capable of impressing others. We don't have to try to impress others. The only thing we have to do is just be faithful, and God will do the rest. And that was what this whole prayer journey for me was. And so thinking about that, there's a story in the Bible that is, it's one of the more well-known stories, but thinking about like, well, who in the Bible had to have that kind of faith, and what kind of time did they spend with God to have that kind of faith? I thought about Abraham, and in Genesis chapter 22, Abraham takes his son Isaac up on the mountain and is going to sacrifice him, going to kill him. And we all know, as the story goes, the Lord provides a ram at just the right time, and Abraham's obedience is brought to light, and his faith is tested, and he came through because he knew God would provide. And everybody knows that story, but a lot of people don't go back all the way to Genesis 12 and say, well, how did Abraham get that faith? You don't get faith all at one time. You don't get everything that God has for you all at one time. God just asks you to take a step. And a lot of times we want things now because, we live in a instant, fast-paced world and a what's next mentality, so to speak. And I started looking at Abraham, and in Genesis chapter 12 is where his journey begins. That's when God calls him. God asked Abraham to leave everything he had to go to a place that he didn't know. And having a relationship with God is just God asking you to trust him and taking a step. And so that's all I'm doing, and that's all I'm asking you to do here tonight even, or today. One thing that all this has made me realize is that prayer produces faith. And I want my faith to be as big as my prayers. I want, often you pray for miracles and you pray for healing, or you pray for revival, or you pray for your community to be changed, but does your faith match all those prayers? And so this year, I'm spending a lot of time in prayer, obviously, and it made me realize that another comment I heard this week just in spending time with God and praying and studying was, the church is 10 miles wide and a quarter inch deep. And it kind of made me laugh how God, works things out, because this is diving deeper, so to speak. And this is us going deeper. But when we think about the church or coming to church on Sunday, we do a great job of celebrating and or coming and getting a word from God for an hour. But the Monday through Saturday is the depth, the pool, so to speak. And I grew up in a small town called Keener, and right beside that, the next town over was a town called Faison. And if any of y'all remember, when they were building Interstate 40, they would dig these ponds to build the overpasses to go over them. And I was just thinking about it this morning, like there used to be this pond in Faison that we would try to go fishing and or swimming in, and the guy that owned the pond would always tell us, there's no fish in there, and there's no point in really swimming in there because it's only about 2 to 3 foot deep. But on the surface, it looked like this huge lake, and we never really believed the guy. And one day he just took off walking across the pond, and we just knew eventually he was going to sink. But he didn't. He walked all the way across. And it just, on the surface, we look good, and we can talk about our relationship, but is there any depth to it? And I don't know about you, but I want to know Jesus like I know my wife. So in the grand scheme of all that, I'll leave you with 2 things. Who's your best friend? How do they become your best friend? Whether that's your wife or a friend or a brother or sister or whoever, wherever you're at in your stage of life, and compare or contrast that relationship to your relationship with God, and what are the differences. And like I said, the first step in noticing that maybe there needs to be a change is just admitting it and realizing where you're at. And the only thing God asks you to do is take a step, because as we saw, and as the writer in Hebrews chapter 11, you know, the Hall of Faith chapter says, Abraham was mentioned in the Hall of Faith because of his faith. And that's all God asks us to have, is faith. So I hope you will take a step in that direction, and thank you for diving deeper.